My name is Terry Roberts, from Little Rock I come. I went down to the schoolhouse, the place they kept me from. I went down to that schoolhouse, and this is what I saw. State troopers with steel helmets in the state of Arkansas. I went up to the troopers and said, please let me in. And all their guns were pointed at the color of my skin. They kept me from the schoolhouse where I might be by law. And that's what they call justice in the state of Arkansas. Now his name is Orval Faubus, the governor of the state. He sent his army charging down, 9 kids was at the gate. 300 National Guard were there, dressed up to fight a war. And that is why I'm late for school in the state of Arkansas. Oh, listen, Mr. Governor and Mr. President, too. Give me that Constitution, that's what you've got to do. Give me that Constitution, I ask for nothing more. Yes, that's what I want to study in the state of Arkansas. My name is Terry Roberts, from Little Rock I come. I went down to the schoolhouse, the place they kept me from. I went down to that schoolhouse, and this is what I saw. State troopers with steel helmets in the state of Arkansas.
Good evening. Reading from page 103 in Turn Away Thy Son. Terrence Roberts was the best student in the group of 9, and perhaps for that reason he was to become one of the main targets of the segregationists. His father was a Navy veteran and a dietitian. His mother was a cateress. The large Roberts family were Seventh-day Adventists and very religious. Terrence's father had attended meetings all summer discussing integration, but remained ambivalent about his son's attending Central until the governor's actions made it a matter of principle. When newsmen asked Terrence if the NAACP had pressured him to attend Central, the idealistic 15-year-old responded, quote, "Nobody urged me to go. The school board asked if I wanted to go. I thought if I got in, some of the other children would be able to go and have more opportunities." On September the 25th, 2007, Terry Roberts, the other 8 members of the Little Rock 9, and the world will return to Little Rock to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. I had the privilege of helping coordinate the 40th ceremony in 1997. Among the many things associated with that commemoration, I accompanied Terry Roberts when he saw the Central Tigers play basketball for the first time. You see, when Terry was at Central, the African American students not only couldn't play sports, but they couldn't even attend the games. As many in this room already know, Central High School is a special place to our family. All of our children graduated there, and I have spent many years questioning why at a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, did America face its most challenging constitutional crisis since the Civil War. Betsy Jacoway's book, Turn Away Thy Son, is a powerful, compelling, and at times heartbreaking story of what did happen, and most importantly, why it happened. To me, the most revealing part of her book is on page 228, when she writes, quote, "The lengthening chronicle of harassment of the 9 led New York Times reporter Gertrude Samuels to suggest the mob has moved inside the school. Betsy's book takes us inside Central High School in a way no one has ever done before. When you read this very well-researched and documented account, you will witness the depth of the abuse and how some in authority actually tolerate it. This book is rich. It does not shy away from controversy. It challenges conventional wisdom. It makes some people and some families uncomfortable. But most importantly, it causes people to think, to react, and to engage in this much needed and continuing dialogue. After all, there are still many people who have yet to come to grips with this story and don't yet understand it. Betsy grew up in Little Rock, graduated from the University of Arkansas, earned her PhD in history at the University of North Carolina. She now lives in Newport, where her husband Tim is an attorney and where they have raised their family. She has taught at the University of Florida, UALR, and at Lyon College, where she and I now serve together on the Board of Trustees. I am Skip Rutherford, a past president of the Little Rock School Board and now Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. Ladies and gentlemen, the author of Turn Away Thy Son, Betsy Jacoway.
For all their work to make this evening happen. I want to thank the Clinton students for inviting me to be here tonight, and I especially want to thank all my dear friends that I'm seeing out in the audience who are here to share with me this exciting story. And one of the first times I've talked about it publicly and shared my findings with the world. I was saying to a young woman a minute ago, this has been like my third child. I've nurtured this for 30 years, and I've been very paranoid about having other people steal my thunder, so I haven't talked about it. And now my baby is out there in the world for everyone to appraise, so it's a little scary. Okay, we all know the standard textbook treatment of what happened in Little Rock in 1957. The little thumbnail sketch that's in every high school textbook is that the opportunistic governor of Arkansas, bad old Orville Faubus, called the National Guard to keep the 9 black children out of Central High School for his own advantage, for his own political gain. If it had not been for Orville Faubus, according to the story, the schools would have integrated without difficulty, and Little Rock was certainly prepared, and that should have all gone off without a hitch. It's been my experience that few people in Little Rock or elsewhere know anything much beyond that story, that little thumbnail sketch. There's very little depth of understanding of what happened here. And once I began to probe and ask questions, I began to realize that everybody was kind of embarrassed that they didn't know more about this story. They somehow thought everybody else did, but somehow they had missed out and just didn't really know how it all fit together. What I have found is that the real story of what happened in Little Rock was consciously suppressed at the time. The story was distorted consciously, and that's why we don't know what happened here, because it was a conscious effort on the part of a number of people to keep the truth from being known. One of the distorters was our old heroic figure, Harry Ashmore, who was editor of the Arkansas Gazette. And the Gazette won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for its coverage of the crisis. Harry is one of the courageous figures who stood up to bad old Faubus. So how in the world can I possibly say that? Bear with me, and I'll tell you. The other source of distortion in Little Rock was the FBI. In September of 1957, the FBI was sent into Little Rock to investigate what was happening here. Harry Ashmore had told the people in the Justice Department what he was telling everybody, that this was a manufactured crisis. The editorial he wrote was "The Crisis Mr. Faubus Made." And so I really believe, although I don't write this because I don't have proof for it, but I think they wanted to arrest Orville Faubus. I think they were trying to catch him in these lies when the FBI came in and did 500 interviews between September 4th and September 14th. 87 of those interviews talk about rumors of violence or threats of violence that the interviewee had heard about. Because the interviews did not reveal what the FBI was hoping to find, that report was never released. It was suppressed. And although it sat on the judge's bench during one of the key trials, and there'd been a lot of media hype about how that FBI report was going to prove that Faubus was wrong, he never alluded to the report. I think it's because he knew that if he used it on appeal, which would happen, he would have to make it available to the lawyers on the other side. And so that report was suppressed. Thank goodness Tony Fryer, a scholar at UALR, used the Freedom of Information Act to get it. Just 1 year before the 25-year statute of limitations would have caused it to be destroyed. And so we have it. And it's been the source of much of the information in my book. I encourage anyone who's got a sturdy constitution to go out to UALR and look at it. It is huge, it's bulky, it's poorly organized, it's really inaccessible, and I think that's on purpose because the FBI really didn't want people reading it. You have to read it all the way through and really hang in there to make sense out of it. But the investment is worth the time. That's where I got lots of good juicy stuff. Okay, I also want to suggest, and I do in my book, that not only has the story of the Little Rock crisis been distorted, but it's also wrong. And I want to tell you a little bit of why the standard mythology, the standard treatment is wrong. Now, I want to back up for a minute and tell you where I came from in all of this. As I say in the preface to my book, I was 13 when the crisis broke. I was totally mindless. I lived up in the Heights in a culture that encouraged little girls to be cute. And my daddy said frequently, little girls aren't supposed to think about unhappy things. And so I didn't. I didn't know anybody at Central High School. I wasn't going to go to Central High School. We didn't have a television. I didn't see those images. And somehow that whole thing just went by me. I knew it was happening, but I had no idea what the issues were. What is even more astonishing to me now as I look back on it, my family was closely related to several of the major players, and they were in and out of my house. And yet none of this was ever discussed in my presence. And I'm almost conspiratorial about that. I think that the idea was that the little girls and the women weren't supposed to think about those things. So I really, when I finally went to graduate school and came into the real world, and I only went because my daddy made me go. At that point, I was a very good little girl. Actually, I always was. But he forced me to go, insisted that I go, and I went. And I discovered, to my horror, in a course on the South since Reconstruction, all of the kinds of things that white people had done to black people in the South that I had never heard of, that I didn't know anything about. And at first I was unbelieving. I thought I would throw some of this. I mean, this can't be true. And then it began to dawn on me, I lived through one of the major events of American history, the Little Rock crisis, and I've never asked any questions about it. And I know all these people. I wonder if maybe I could go home and write about this. So I went home and told Daddy that I was going to write about the Little Rock. He said, no, you're not. He was still practicing law, and he knew that that would stir people up, and he was not going to have it. So I didn't. Thank goodness I found another topic that was great, and I'm making this much too long. But the bottom line is, when I finally did come around to study the Little Rock crisis, I knew very little about it. Almost nothing. Largely for the same reason that most people don't know much about it. There just wasn't much out there that was really useful. But I had been working under George Tyndall at Chapel Hill, and I had learned how to be a historian with my dissertation, which was on a safe South Carolina topic where everybody was dead, and that was much easier. But Dr. Tyndall had stressed that the way to write history is not to go out and read what everybody else has read about the topic that you're interested in. Instead, and you don't do that, because if you do that, then you're simply going to adopt their point of view. You're going to adopt their conclusions. You're going to ask their questions. So he said what you do is you go out and you read in the primary sources. You go to archives and you read people's papers, you read their letters, you read their diaries if they wrote them, you read the public documents that came out of that period. And that's messy. And it takes a lot of time. You go to the Brooks Hayes papers, you really don't know much about Brooks Hayes, you don't know much about what he was involved in, you start reading his mail. And it gets really interesting, but you don't know what it is you're really collecting here. And you have a general idea of where you want to go with this, and so you start taking copious notes, and questions begin to come into your mind about the material you're gathering. And sure enough, you begin to form your own ideas and conclusions about what was happening here. So I spent the year 1976 on an NEH grant going all around the country reading other people's mail, and I really had a wonderful time doing it. It wasn't until, I guess, 10 years ago that I started reading the secondary literature. And everybody knew I was writing a book about the Little Rock crisis, and I was terrified that somebody was going to start pinning me down that so-and-so said such and such. And I didn't want to have to give this whole speech about why you don't read the secondary material. But by the time I got to all the secondary material, I already knew what I thought had happened. And it was a much better strategy. The one other major maxim of George Tyndall, he had a Cleo's Decalogue. Cleo is the historian, the muse of historians. And in his 10 Commandments of the Muse, number 9 is, "Thou shalt not pass judgment upon mankind, nor yet pardon any man or woman for anything. Thou mayest seek the reason for error, but neither the excuse nor the blame. Vengeance is mine, saith the Muse." So those are the two key points that I went out into the world trying to research this topic. One, that I wanted to form my own conclusions, and two, that I was not in the business of passing judgment. So some people have criticized me for not being harder on the segregationists, or not being, praising the good guys and damning the bad guys, but I don't think that's what my job is. My job is to gather the material in as full and balanced and fair a way as I can and tell the story fully. And it's up to you as an intelligent reader to draw your own conclusions. Okay, so let me tell you what did happen here. And the story is very complicated and it can be confusing, so pay attention. I'm going to try to compress into 10 minutes what it has taken me 30 years to sort out. So let's have a romp through this stuff. All right, the Brown decision was handed down in 1954 that said separate and equal it didn't work. You had to have integration. But the Brown decision did not say integrate immediately. They said we're going to send this material back to the states, and we're going to let them submit arguments about how we should go about integrating. So Virgil Blossom was the new superintendent of schools in Little Rock. He had just integrated in Fayetteville, and it had been easy. They only had 6 black kids up there. And so he thought, he said, hey, I can go to Little Rock and show them how to do it. He was a schoolman who was on top of the decisions that were coming down through the Supreme Court, through the court system, and he knew integration was coming. So the very week that the Brown decision was handed down, Blossom called together his school board, and he told them, we are going to have to do this. We are going to have to integrate. And so we might as well just step out front and do it voluntarily. He had some strong segregationists on that school board who didn't run the next time. And they had some concerns about it. But he was a strong-willed man, and he persuaded those people that they needed to issue a public statement in May of 1954 that they were going to comply. So they did. Blossom went all over. Well, first of all, he had meetings with all kinds of public groups trying to sell the idea and gather information for how they should proceed in Little Rock. His first thought was that they should integrate at the first grade. But he immediately found that the parents were most concerned about letting little bitty kids integrate when they had already formed their racist views. They wanted to maintain this racial purity, this separation of the races. So they persuaded Blossom that he should start at the high school level, where these views had already been formed. Blossom gives about 200 speeches around the community, and he thinks he has prepared the community. All the signs are that the community is willing to accept integration. In the summer of 1956, segregationist firebrand Jim Johnson ran against Orville Faubus. And Johnson's whole campaign was about maintaining segregation. Faubus was a populist, a progressive, a liberal. His father was an old mountain socialist. His middle name was Eugene. He was named for Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate for president way back. Faubus had no history of racism, didn't even see black people until he was 23 years old. But he was a politician, and he could see which way the wind was blowing. And the stronger Jim Johnson talked his racist line, the more Faubus got pushed to the right. And by the end of the campaign, Faubus heard himself saying to his own horror, no school system will be forced to integrate against its will as long as I'm governor. Well, there he had made that promise. And in the fall, although Jim Johnson was soundly defeated, he only carried 7 counties out of 75. And that seemed to be, to everybody, just a clear endorsement of integration that this was going to proceed. Still, Johnson had a very strong following, and he got an amendment to the Constitution, to the Arkansas Constitution, on the ballot in November of 1956, in which he said, it was so strong it would kill corn and knee high. He said it was really too strong for me. It was actually, I think, in large part written or influenced by strong segregationists from up deep south. But what that amendment said was called the Interposition Amendment. It said that the governor should have the power to interpose the power of the state between the citizen and the power of the federal government, and that in the event that integration was demanded, the governor could actually resist. Now, this was only going to work if Johnson was governor, because he would have resisted. But this won by huge margins in the election in November, and Faubus took note that is what the people want. The people do want to resist integration. In the winter of 1957, the legislature was in session, and 4 laws got passed by the legislature that called for ways to preserve segregation. Faubus knew that those laws were not going to stand up. He knew that federal law supersedes state law, but he was a politician. And he knew that since those laws are on the book, and since he as governor is sworn to uphold the laws of the state of Arkansas, he has to have a court test of those laws, and have them declared unconstitutional before he can say to the people, you know, I did everything I could, but I can't defy the law. As long as those laws are on the books and they're untested, he's in trouble. Faubus knew that this whole integration issue was dangerous, and he didn't want to have anything to do with it. So, when Blossom begins to panic in the summer of 1957, when the Capital Citizens Council, the strong segregationist group, really starts a huge campaign in the summer of 1957 and starts badgering Faubus and Blossom in the newspaper, the school board panics, and especially Virgil Blossom panics. He and Faubus had known each other for a long time. They worked together in education in northwest Arkansas. Blossom starts going to see Faubus every day, calls him 6 times. Faubus says he badgered him, he shadowed me, he became a nuisance because he was always there saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to help us if there are difficulties, if there is violence in the fall? Will you call out the National Guard to enforce integration? Faubus says, no. I'm not going to enforce integration. This is your plan, Virgil. This isn't my plan. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And my view has always been hands off. My view has always been if a community wants to integrate, that's fine. They can integrate. I'm not going to stop it. But if they don't want to integrate, I just said in the election last summer, no city will be forced to integrate against its will. So, many things happen through the summer to increase Virgil Blossom's panic. He takes a bullet through his kitchen. He takes a bullet through his car door. His wife picks up the phone and her life is threatened. He is threatened daily on the telephone that his daughters will be killed, that his house will be bombed. Any one of us would panic. And he was a big guy who was used to pushing and getting his way. And he thought if he just pushed Orville Faubus hard enough, he could make that man yield to him. Well, in all these exchanges between Faubus and Blossom during the summer, Blossom began to develop an understanding of Faubus's position and why Faubus didn't want to be involved, why it would be political suicide for Faubus to get involved. And he realized that what Faubus needed was a delay so that a court test could be launched to test these 4 Arkansas laws. So they started kind of scratching each other's back, trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this thing work? Enter at this point Wayne Upton, who was on the school board and lived across the street from Faubus. Upton was a lawyer. He went to Fort Smith to meet with federal judge John Miller, and he pulled him aside and said, Judge, if a case is brought, and I'm not saying that there will be, but just if a case is brought to your court in which a case has been successfully tried in a state court, granting an injunction against the school board for integration in Little Rock this fall, would you uphold that injunction? And John Miller, completely unethically, says, yes, I would. And in fact discusses with him how in fact this case might be drawn. So Upton comes back to Little Rock, tells Blossom this. Blossom says, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. I mean, I had no idea. Blossom and Upton go out to see Faubus, tell him about this, and they all kind of get in this together. And Blossom persuades Faubus to find a plaintiff for this case. Now, I told you this was confusing. It is. This is very complicated, and you really have to sort it out. But what we have going on here in a nutshell is that the school board, or part of the school board, is now engaging in a plan to sabotage its own plan of integration. For all kinds of reasons that I talk about in the book, they didn't want to just come out in the open and say, we're afraid of violence and we therefore want to go to the federal judge and ask for a delay. But that is in essence what was going on. They were terrified of violence. They talked about it all the time. They told Faubus about it all the time. They called Bill Smith over to Blossom's house one night. Bill Smith was Faubus's lawyer. Showed him a drawer full of knives that they said had been taken away from students in their lockers, and that this was all in preparation in case integration happened. So everybody's getting panicky here. Okay, I said 10 minutes, and I think I might be already over that. They do get a case worked up. Murray Reed was Chancery Judge. Murray Reed was a Faubus appointee. They come up with a plaintiff to file a suit for an injunction in state court to sue the school board and get an injunction against them to stop integration. This goes before Murray Reed. Blossom goes out to the mansion the night before and says, "Please, Orville, testify." Orville has been subpoenaed, but at that time a governor doesn't have to respond to a subpoena. So Orville thinks he's doing Virgil a favor, and he thinks he's doing the school board a favor. So he says, "Okay, I will testify." The next day he comes into court a little late, seats himself over on the side, and Virgil Blossom is giving his testimony. And the lawyer for the school board, Archie House, says, "Mr. Blossom, are you concerned about violence in Little Rock in September?" And Blossom, who has been out to the mansion every single night telling Faubus about all these rumors and dangers of violence, says, "I never gave it a thought." And Orville Faubus is sitting there saying, "What? You know, this is a change in strategy. They just haven't told me about this, but they're going to explain this to me." So Faubus gets on the stand, tells about all his concerns about violence. Sure enough, the judge issues the injunction because the governor says there's such a danger of violence. At that point, Archie House has prepared for this contingency, the lawyer, and he walks straight from the Pulaski County Courthouse over to the federal building. He goes in to see the federal judge, who you remember was supposed to be John Miller and was supposed to uphold this injunction. As soon as John Miller heard that Murray Reed had handed down this injunction, he recused himself. So we have, all of a sudden, a new judge in the courthouse, Judge Ronald Davies, who had been in town for 3 days. He was from North Dakota. He didn't have black people in his constituency. He had never thought much about the problems of integration. He was a new jurist, and he was nervous about this whole situation, as you can imagine. This was one of his first assignments, and he drew a really big one. So some people have said, you know, why in the world would Judge Miller recuse? And there are lots of explanations for it, but I think it's very interesting that was on Friday. On Sunday, it was announced in the Arkansas Gazette that Senator McClellan had introduced a bill that would expand the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals and add another judge. And the lawyer that they were suggesting should be added was John Miller. So I think he knew he didn't want to hurt his chances of that. Orville Faubus, as you can imagine, goes into a panic. He is now twisting in the wind. He feels that he has been betrayed by Virgil Blossom and by the Little Rock School Board. He feels he's been betrayed by the federal judge because Faubus had also had a fishing trip with John Miller and had gotten this same commitment. He had called the Justice Department 3 times asking for help. And finally, they had sent Arthur Caldwell down here, who was an Arkansas native, to talk to him, but Caldwell was totally unsympathetic and told him there was nothing the federal government could do. There's a long story behind that, too. So Faubus sends his state police out to do investigations over the weekend and find out just how much danger of violence there is. At the same time, the segregationists, led by Jim Johnson, mount a telephone campaign and badger Faubus all weekend with threats of violence. They tell him that caravans are headed to Little Rock with, armed men and all kinds of stuff, most of which was not true. But from his investigations and from rumors that he was hearing, Bill Smith, an old guy, came in and sat across his desk and told Bill Smith that he had lived a good life, that he was old, and he felt so strongly that integration was wrong, that if it proceeded the next Tuesday as planned, he planned to take his gun to Central High School and kill as many of those black kids as he could before they got him. And that kind of story Faubus was hearing over the weekend. It was very frightening, very disconcerting to him. So on Sunday afternoon, he called his lawyer, Bill Smith, to come into his office, and he said, I've decided to use the National Guard. I've decided I'm going to stop integration, and I want you to prepare the order. Bill Smith tried to talk him out of it. He said, Orville, this is a bad decision. You need to wait until there's some violence over there before you may take an action like this. And Faubus said, Bill, you are canceling the course of a moral weakling. If I did that, just think how I would feel if years down the road or months down the road, a mother came and sat across the desk from me and said, Governor Faubus, you said that you were worried about the danger of violence. Was that really a concern of yours? And I would have to say yes. And she said, if you hadn't acted, my child would still be alive. If you had acted to prevent that violence, my child would still be alive. Faubus said, Bill, I can't live with that. I'm not going to pursue that course. Now, cynics in the group, and certainly beyond this group, have said, oh gosh, you can't believe Faubus. I mean, that's something he manufactured later, that kind of excuse. But Bill Smith also told that same story in his interview with the Eisenhower Administration Project, and I felt like there was an element of truth in it. So he called out the National Guard, surrounded Central High School. The Guard had no written orders on that first day. That first day they were not ordered to keep the black children out of Central High School. They were ordered to keep the peace. And probably Faubus was just smart enough that he knew he shouldn't put something in writing that was going to get him in trouble, that would be open defiance of the federal government. But the fact was he had not issued an order that integration should not proceed, just that the peace should be maintained. Overnight, he changed that stance and he did issue written orders to the Guard. But my thinking about it is that Faubus was hoping, after all this situation of getting backed into a corner, I think he was hoping that he would take this stance of defiance by calling out the Guard, and that Eisenhower would immediately federalize the Guard. And actually, that's probably what Eisenhower should have done. If Eisenhower had simply federalized the Guard, obviously there would be problems of whether or not those Arkansas boys would have obeyed. But I think Eisenhower made a tremendous strategic decision when he sent the Army in here that conjured up visions of Reconstruction. It was horrifying to people to have troops in an American city and around an American school. And that action hardened the segregationist sentiment so much that it became a tremendous political liability to Eisenhower, and he started the next day trying to get those troops out of here. He was not able to. But I think he would have been much wiser to simply federalize the Guard. That would have let Faubus off the hook. He could have saved face politically. They would have had to beef up all kinds of plans, but I think it certainly would have been a much better solution. Okay, where are we? Oh, I'm already over. Let me just say two things. Harry Ashmore. Why am I saying that he was a part of the problem here when obviously he was so much a part of the solution? Ashmore had just written his magnum opus. He had just written the book that he had wanted to write for years. In fact, In the month of June of 1957, he sat in his office and he put the finishing touches on a book that he called An Epitaph for Dixie, in which he argued that change is inevitable in the South. We have all these forces working for change. Industrialization, mechanization of agriculture, urbanization, movement of black population out of the rural South. All of this is going to lead to integration. It's going to lead to a change in the Southern culture. And it's inevitable. This is going to happen. And we're not going to have violence in the South because the South's businessmen aren't going to allow it. The businessmen know that the hope for the South is to attract northern industry down here. And they know that if they have problems in the streets, rioting, that they're not going to be able to attract industry. Ashmore wrote this book. He sent it off to Norton Press. He took a month's vacation. And when he came back to Little Rock in August, his city editor, Bill Shelton, was out because Shelton's wife was dying and she died. And so in August, Harry Ashmore had responsibility for the news function as well as the editorial function of the paper. And I think he simply was not tuned in. He had been out of the state the year before working for Adlai Stevenson. And he missed that whole summer campaign between Jim Johnson and Faubus. I think he missed it. And his ego was on the line at that point. He had just written this book that made what obviously had become a false claim. It infuriated him that little old country Orville Faubus, who had been sort of Ashmore's boy up to that point, now wouldn't follow his lead and do what he told him to do. Ashmore had a deep love for the Democratic Party. He described it somewhere as my own true love. And he really believed that what Faubus was about was a third-party vote, like the Dixiecrats had done in 1948. That Faubus was going to lead a movement that would only hurt the Democratic Party of Southerners into a third-party movement. I think Ashmore was trying to strong-arm Faubus by writing editorials like The Crisis Mr. Faubus Made, when he knew some of the inside story about some of these maneuvers with the federal judge. He knew about that the school board had gone wobbly, and he still, I think, was trying to badger Faubus. I think if Ashmore had dealt with Faubus with a lighter hand, the story could have ended up very differently. So that's one of the reasons I give Ashmore a hard time. I think the result of all of this between Ashmore and the FBI is that the story has been distorted and suppressed. And I think that suits a lot of people's agenda. When I was at the 40th anniversary, I was on the planning committee to plan all the events at Central High. And I thought naively, I walked into the first meeting thinking, oh, well, I'm the historian, they want all my good information. There were so many agendas around that table, I could not believe it. Everybody wanted to make sure that Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so or Daddy or person themselves was cast in a good light. And that the story got told the way they wanted it told. And I think the agenda of a lot of people in Little Rock has been, it's a lot easier to put all the blame for the Little Rock crisis on one evil man. To blame Orville Faubus. And therefore we can say, oh, we would have done it without his intervention. Little Rock was prepared and we were moving ahead. That's a lot easier to do than to examine a racist culture and to assume responsibility for the changes that have to be made in people's hearts before we can approach anything resembling equity in our society.
The book was shy away from controversy. We have with us tonight C-SPAN's Book TV filming this. And we're going to open it for questioning, but I need you, before you ask the questions, to let the microphone come to you. So don't ask a question until you get the microphone in your hand. So I presume we are getting close to that, and I'm looking around, and I'm not sure where everybody is. For the microphones. Have you got one, Bob? Who's got? Jose's got one. Okay. Would you raise your hand and we'll take it? Okay, there's a question right over here, Bob.
With all the research you've done in the past and bringing out what 57 happened, and living here today, compare us together in this room. How are we today compared to them?
Ooh. In some ways, we're better. Largely, I think, because many white people have examined their consciences and their hearts and have decided that the system of oppression that we lived under for 300 years in this society wouldn't do. On the other hand, I'm not sure we've come all that far. Our schools are resegregating. We have white flight in this community. We have major problems in some of our school systems. And I think that the source of that problem is the racism that continues to infect the hearts of many white people.
Okay. Annie, let's wait for the mic, please.
My question is that you selected the subject of your book. It has a biblical reference. Could you explain that as question number one? How did that and the Proverbs from which it came, which is a wisdom book. The second one is that now that we are going through another ethnicity of people of color, Hispanic, have we learned anything from when we were trying to understand African American and European Americans in Arkansas? I'm Annie Abrams. You said my name, so I didn't have to say it. Yeah.
Annie, you asked such easy questions. Well, yes, the title of my book is drawn from Deuteronomy 7, which is a biblical injunction against intermarriage. Obviously, in Deuteronomy, they're talking about racial differences, religious differences. My editor thought we could use a little literary license and talk about racial differences. The reason I wanted to highlight that is because I was astonished as I conducted my research. At every stage of the process of the Little Rock crisis, what I found over and over again was articulated fears of what they call race mixing. Southerners, black and white, have always been so mannerly that we don't talk about sexual concerns openly for the most part. But in the heat of the civil rights movement, these sexual concerns rose to the level of verbal discourse. And in speeches, in ads in the newspaper, in letters to the editor, it's clearly articulated that what integration will lead to is intermarriage. Now, the irony here, of course, is that white men had always had access to black women for 300 years. What the segregationists were really talking about was the danger of giving black men access to white women, and the fear that that was going to lead to the destruction of white civilization and white culture. So I felt this certainly is not new to me. As you study Southern history, you'll find that at almost every period and in almost every episode, what is at the heart of discussions about race relations is this sexual element. And I was sensitized to that in my graduate study, but I was surprised when I began to read the materials in all these archives about Little Rock and found it so clearly spelled out.
Question, let's get the microphone right back here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Meredith Ross. Betsy, you were in a class with my sister. I was 9 years old at the time, and I had a very different perspective than you're sharing. And for me, the fear was people like the Ku Klux Klan. I couldn't understand why people could be so unaware, so insensitive of other people. It just seemed very hard to me. We had, I don't know if you mentioned this in your book, but we had Daniel Shore in our house. We had this very small house back then, and as a 9-year-old, I was back in the hallway listening to him interviewing people in our living room. And I was, I don't know, cute, but I was a little girl and fairly polite. And yet the discussion was very open in our home and among friends that I had. And I'm sharing this. I don't mean, I'm just sharing we all had different experiences. The signs that said white people, black people, whatever for the bathrooms, whatever, were horrifying to me as a child. And that was the horror that I experienced and that my family talked about and felt. And we looked at other examples in history of discrimination. So,
Well, both of your parents were very involved on the side of racial justice from the start. I think it needs to be said you're Jewish, and that gave you a different perspective. I've thought recently, you know, it was just 10 years since the Holocaust at this time, and it had to be horrifying and terrifying to see these kinds of attitudes being expressed toward black people.
and can I just say, that's absolutely right. And in response to what you said, Annie, I guess I feel that whether it's Hispanic or whatever, it seems very hard for me to keep, thinking that what difference does it make? Why is it so hard to get it? So I'm just sharing. Yes, my Jewish background gave me, maybe some insight or some perspective that was different. But it just seems like that was the hardest thing to
We got some more questions over there. People trying to, there's one over here. We're trying to get to the phone.
Listen, could you find any evidence? I lived previous that year, I worked with Congressman Chuck Athens at the time, very
Talk to the microphone, Mr. Westbrook, please.
to politics and sensitive to politics. Did you find any reason to think that Orville Paulus might have done this because he was getting ready to run for a third term? And he had been considered a liberal, as we all know. But all of a sudden, he was interested, apparently, in running for a third term, and that was almost unprecedented in Arkansas history. He wanted to cope with the eastern Arkansas people who were much more concerned about this than southwestern Arkansas or northwestern Arkansas. Did you find any evidence of the fact that it might have been just a political maneuver that got out of hand?
Sure. I mean, Orville Faubus had talked a lot about the possibilities of running for a third term, and there had been political cartoons in the papers in the summer kind of laying that out. And he told me, and he told other interviewers, that he had thought a lot about it, but he really wasn't sure he wanted to run for a third term. What he really wanted was Bill Fulbright's seat in the Senate. But Fulbright wasn't going to be up for election again until '62. And so he was trying to figure out how to fill that gap. And he was considering a whole bunch of things. But I think he didn't, and lots of people are going to argue with me on this, but I think I've satisfied myself that he didn't really settle on running for a third term until after the Little Rock crisis, when he called Jim Johnson in and said, I've decided I'm going to run. Jim had thought he would be the heir apparent the next time around. And we'll work to get you on the Supreme Court.
Questions? I've got one, Betsy. This is my question. When you when I've read this book, and obviously I read it, when I finished reading the book, by the way, I emailed her about 34 questions, and she responded to that promptly. But what went on inside the school, the mob inside the school, was really worse than the story has been told. There are some who say that the white kids at Central in 1957 were heroes because they didn't do anything. They didn't shove, they didn't push, they didn't hit. And in fact, but some would say that we didn't even know this was going on. Your story says things were happening that even the principal didn't discipline fairly. Were the white kids who did nothing heroes?
Oh, Skip, you really put me on the spot. No, obviously, they were not heroic for maintaining silence, but I think you have to keep in mind, it's back to that business of the culture that we were living in at that time, and where little girls were not supposed to think those kinds of things. It's hard for us to remember that kids were much more under control then than they are now, and more responsive to their parents' wishes. And I know my parents made it very clear that, not about the Little Rock crisis, but about all kinds of things, that I was not to create any difficulties, that I was not to get into any trouble, that I was not to call attention to myself, and that I was to be a good girl at all times. And I have heard from lots of the white kids at Central that they were basically told to just stay out of everything. And early on, some of the white kids did try to befriend the blacks, and they began to be badgered by these thugs, and they backed off. It is true Central is a very big school, and things can happen in corners and under stairwells that don't get seen. But I think most of the harassment of the 9, the worst of it, happened in gym class, and where kids did see it. And I think a lot more people saw things and talked about it at home than we have known about. But I have to say, too, that this was a part of the strategy of the school board. Blossom wanted very much, I'll just tell you, Blossom wanted to be governor. And he thought that successfully integrating the high schools in Little Rock was going to make that happen. And he just was not going to give up on that idea and that hope. So he made it real clear to his staff and to the school board and to the faculty at Central, they were not to talk about what happened inside that school. And Harry Ashmore later kind of, bemoaned the fact that he didn't make any of this public, when Ashmore and his reporters did know some of what was going on inside Central High, which was just horrendous, and it was daily. I don't know how those 9 kids turned out to be normal, lovely human beings, and they all are. But a part of the reason that it hasn't been talked about and nobody really knew about it was Blossom suppressed it, and the newspapers didn't print it.
Yes, right here again, we have one next question. Bob's going to give you the. There you go.
You've spoken about the historical and the cultural circumstances in which this took place, and certainly they're very unique in some ways to Little Rock and to the South. But wasn't there a larger cultural setting in the United States which certainly contributed to the dynamics of what happened in Little Rock and continues today? You talk about the fact that we've got segregated schools in Little Rock, we've got segregated schools in New York, we've got segregated schools in Chicago, Detroit, what have you. So isn't that an important part of the whole thing?
That is, and I'm interested to hear you say that with a northern accent, but it is true that this is not a Southern problem. This is an American problem. And it stems from the racism in the heart of white America.
That's a good question. Let's see who has not asked a question. They're from right here.
questions. One is, as an historian, you described how you were raised, and you termed where you were raised the Heights. How difficult is it to become objective, read the primary sources, even though, as you self-described, you were ignorant? It's hard for me to believe that you didn't hear from friends, segregationist views, whatever, or opinions of this civic leader versus that. So how, as an historian, is that an issue? Do you have to fight it consciously? That's my first question. The second question is, you talked about now your baby's out. I'm curious if you could share how that group has responded to your baby.
What group?
In which you were raised, among which you were raised, the little girls who were supposed to be seen and not heard, and who didn't know that all this was going on.
The first question, two good questions. The first question is raises the issue that every historian has to deal with, of objectivity. Is there such a thing? And aren't we all prejudiced, biased? Don't we all have our own preconceptions? And especially if you're an insider. There are difficulties with being an outsider. You know, you're not sensitized to certain things. And certainly there are difficulties with being an insider, because you do have preconceived notions of who are the people to listen to and who, you know, are the important people, whatever. Actually, that is probably the main reason that I chose the mechanical approach that I did to the story. I moved the story forward chronologically, but in each chapter, I tried to look out through the eyes of a different actor. And that my hope was that I would distance myself somewhat from the narrative by letting each major participant that I chose, and I chose them based on the sources that were available to me, largely. That way, if I gave it a good faith effort to present each person fairly, to present each person in terms that they would endorse, then I would overcome my own. And that's just my personal bias about how the world works. I really don't believe in heroes and villains. I don't know any of either variety. I'm sure there are psychopaths out there. I don't think I know any. But my view is that all of us are frail, flawed human beings doing the best we can. And I think that that is what was true in Little Rock in 1957. The reaction of my friends has been total amazement. You know, wow, I never understood this. And yes, you are right. We were in a bubble. And now I see why I didn't understand this. Now, it's just been out a month. You know, in 6 months I may have bricks thrown at me. But so far, it's been a positive response.
You can come back here, we'll protect you. We're used to getting bricks around here. Any other questions? Let's see. Who has not? Here's one that asked a question.
I was really taken aback by your assertion that the National Guard should have been federalized. I was shocked by that, really, because I was in that unit after that time period, and it was totally white and totally, I don't say totally racist, but lots of jokes, lots of in jokes. I can't believe that that group would have protected those black students like the Army units that Eisenhower brought in here. So
I'm sure they would not.
Well, you said it was a big mistake. And I've got your book, and I've partly through it, but I'm going to look at it in a circumspect way. And I'm really concerned that that's, that position that you came up with after all this study really worries me.
Okay, well, actually, I don't assume that position in the book. I don't argue either way in the book. But what I was arguing about the 101st is that the use of the Army was so polarizing. From the standpoint, and maybe I'm completely naive about the ability of those troops to overcome their prejudices and function as they were ordered to do. Do you think that they would not have?
I know that we will.
Well,
Eisenhower didn't ask me.
like I said, it's good. Wait a minute, hold on, Parker. You've already asked a question. Who hadn't asked one here? We got one right here. This gentleman right here. We've got time if you're for one more question. Betsy's going to be signing books, and you can talk with her individually as you sign books. I know this could go on forever. Go ahead, sir.
Someone told me that there was a high school in Little Rock that was at the same time or just prior to the Central High School was integrated quite quietly. Did you find that to be true? And if just fable?
Yeah, Charleston High School was integrated, and Hoxie and Fayetteville, but no place. No, not. It was so quiet.
All right, and final question. Yes, go ahead. Wait a minute, let's get your question. Let's get Mike.
Well, I think I'm going to have to take a different view than the gentleman that just spoke. I was an intern at this time at the medical school. And as you know, the medical college was integrated in 1948. And it was the first school in the South to do that. And in 1956, the new university hospital was completely integrated. Patients, staff. And I was federalized by President Eisenhower in a medical unit. And we had no problems whatsoever about obeying the commanders and carrying on our duty. We lived in very different worlds. And I lived in a world in 1956 that, at least in my microcosm, was integrated. And there was no problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming. Betsy's going to lift your table to sign books. Two things. Number one, we have a reception in our back area afterwards. So for those of you that are lining up for your books, go back and enjoy the reception while this is taking place. And secondly, on your information, the sheet that we handed to you, I want to note, I'm not going to read it, but I want you to read the thing in the box. It's about a request that we're helping one of our students, a project that she is taking on. She is a tsunami survivor herself. Her story is absolutely fascinating, and we're trying to help her neighborhood. So any assistance along that as we pass the hat and the plate, we would appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. We've got some great programs ahead. Betsy, you were terrific. Thanks for being with us.